So welcome everyone to our first Faculty and Lunch and Learn of the season, of the semester. And we're going to be talking about rubrics today. So joining me is Tim Merrill. Tim, would you like to introduce yourself?
Tim Merrill. I work in institutional effectiveness and I've been at the college for finishing my 8th year.
Wow.
Crazy.
Excellent, excellent. So Tim is with us and I am here. I am Karen Layou. I'm a professor of geology here at Reynolds, but this year I'm wearing a different hat. I am the Presidential Faculty Fellow in support of CETL this year. And so the goal of the fellowship is really to help CETL build out faculty PD that is pertinent to our needs. And so one of the things that we see here at the college is that using rubrics has a lot of different benefits to it, not only for students, but also for faculty, and even for the bigger picture of program assessment. And so we're gonna kind of come at this from a couple of different angles today. Now, the other thing I want to stress is that this is totally meant to be an interactive experience. And so those of you on Zoom, please feel free to just jump in at any point with questions, unmute yourselves, ask, interrupt. I'm cool with that. As a teacher. And so again, we want this to be as useful for you as possible. So if you are sitting at a computer, I encourage you at some point to go ahead and open up Canvas, pull up one of your assignments, or even just pull up the rubric section in Canvas if you've not used it before, and we'll kind of talk through some of those items. So let's go. First off, show of hands in this space. I'm gonna actually pull down so I can see those of you in the gallery here. Who uses rubrics on the assignments already? So, okay, we have one here in the room.
David, you do
And then,
some, right?
oh, we've got a whole bunch of folks downtown that are doing it. Excellent, excellent. How about my other colleagues who don't have cameras on? You don't have to turn on, but you can maybe use the reaction in Zoom to show me if you use rubrics. But this is good. So we've got some folks that do, some that don't. Yep. So we'll kind of take it out. Now, here's another question I'll ask. You may use rubrics, but are they Canvas rubrics? How about that? Or do you use Canvas rubrics? Okay, so
it is hard copy, but the results
That's right.
and details is in Canvas.
okay,
So I need something that is embedded
Yeah.
excellent.
on the criterion, the Canvas.
Have you
Okay.
played around with those at all yet? Have you played around with Canvas rubrics? No.
Okay, excellent. Well,
Good.
we will today.
Yeah.
So-
Yeah.
David was pointing out that many of us may have actually designed assignments in the past where we've used them in hard copy, but the idea of actually putting it into Canvas so then it can be used for sort of other purposes as well, and maybe just speed up your grading in Canvas is another way we can tackle this. So I'm interested to hear from the group. What are your thoughts at this point on rubrics? What do you know about them, or do you find them useful? How do your students respond to them? That sort of thing.
I know nothing.
Good.
Okay,
Good.
we have
This
a
one-
rubric virgin in the room. Excellent. Other thoughts?
I need it for the watermarks.
Yay.
Yeah, and also probably going back to where the student is being, strong or need improvement.
Okay,
Absolutely.
And it's easier to probably, browse your Canvas instead of just looking at those hard copies.
Yeah.
right, right. Yes, so there's that idea of being able to see your student performance in Canvas, getting it back to watermark for assessment purposes. Those of you downtown?
I find it much easier to grade using them, and providing them to the students beforehand helps the students understand what it actually is they're going to be graded on.
Yay.
Yes, so we'll be kind of going through some of this, but this is one of these things about transparency in your teaching and learning, which we're going to hear more about on Friday. But the key here is that by letting students see the rubrics ahead of time, like you said, they know what they're being evaluated on. Ideally, they can maybe start to make some of those connections between what they're learning and their student outcomes. I think for me as an instructor, I'm like, wait, what's my learning outcome that I'm supposed to be getting off of my course content summary? Did I get it?
Do you
So
do
that's
that,
another
Karen?
way.
Do you provide it to them in advance sometimes?
The rubrics?
rubrics?
Yeah, the ones
Kathy,
that I
you do that?
use in Canvas are attached to the assignment. And they can
Right off the
But
bat.
I was gonna say just what you said. Sometimes it takes me a couple tries
Yes,
because
Yeah.
I do it, and then when I go to grade it, I'm like, well, that's not really what I was
Yeah.
trying to get
So
at.
the way we do it in the dental is self-evaluation. Evaluate 0, 1, 2, 3. And there
Yes.
are, of course, the descriptions on those criterion.
Mhm.
And then next is peer.
Mhm.
And then I came to the third one. instructor, this is the real grade on the third.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
So
But I,
that's
But the others
how we do
matter.
it in
That's a good
hard
point.
copy.
right.
Self-assessment.
I love that you're having that sort of metacognitive piece of having that, how am I doing in my own learning? That's key for students to have.
Because they are progressing to internship, to externship and getting a job.
That's right.
It's
Absolutely.
really, built in. I really want to design it that way, so they are well skilled before going to the real world.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So have you found that there are any barriers to trying them? So part of it is just learning how literally the mechanics of it in Canvas, right? That's a big piece of it. But any other barriers that people have had to using them or any challenges to having them? I think Kathy, you pointed out that sometimes you create one, you realize this needs to be modified a bit.
And you can't have any secret objectives. Sometimes I have secret objectives.
Aren't listed,
Secret objectives.
the blank box.
Changing your attitude is
I
like.
have heard
often my secret.
discussions about leaving a sort of an extra, right?
Yeah.
That I've measured all this stuff, but what if they did something that doesn't fit into this, or I was expecting to see something.
Yeah, yeah,
like that.
exactly.
To me, the barrier for us in dental is not having this. The hard copies is a barrier because it's hard to, you write down that computer when you're grading them, you just
It'd
plug
be
in
nice to be
right
right
away
there.
Right,
Yeah,
as it happens.
right,
that's right.
right.
It's easier.
That's right. Hopefully.
All right. So Tim, do you want to walk us through some of our goals for today?
Yeah, so again, we want this to be practical, right? So we want to really see how rubrics can be useful. So not just another thing that was done. And David, to your point, as much as we can connect it with the technology tools that we already have. So again, that's why we're assuming some familiarity with Canvas, but I think Karen's going to really show us some practical and tangible examples. Terry and I also work with faculty on how to do this big picture at the general education level. So when we're talking about our big core competencies, not just at the specific disciplines, but are our students writing the way we want them to? Are they thinking qualitatively and scientifically the way we want them to? So we are going to show you some examples of how rubrics can be useful and helpful depending on what you're trying to measure, depending on what you're trying to do. So we'll walk through all of that, again, trying to make it as practical, as useful, as helpful as we can. So that's what we're going to try to do today.
All right. So just briefly thinking about why should I bother? And again, this is more for some folks that are, trying this for the first time. As we've started to highlight here, we're really starting to, from a student perspective, clarifying those expectations of what you're teaching and what you expect them to submit as part of the assignment. I think another key thing is that it gives them a sense of what are the assignment parts, if that makes sense. So if you're doing a project, for example, you might outline that, oh, here I want an annotated bibliography of your research. Here's what we're going to do for the paper portion or the oral presentation part. If you're doing, I'm going to show one on one of the oral presentations that I do that kind of highlights some of the sections they need to cover. Thinking about, again, emphasizing those learning objectives. I think we all know that students kind of gloss right over that information, but the idea is that if we can be more consistent with talking about those with students, then it might become more part of their practice of learning to actually look at that beginning of the chapter, the beginning of your page in Canvas, the course content information. Again, I think there's this piece of increasing self-awareness. So David, I think you brought up a great example of doing that sort of self-check or peer check. And that's, again, an opportunity for students to have that reflective piece. And then there's also this potential to provide more detailed feedback. I think all of us as faculty can agree that when you're assessing students, there's a lot you can tell them, but there's not that much time you have. And so this is a way for you to kind of have more specified feedback and you're just kind of clicking points, and then you can add details as needed. But I think it's more than just you got 10 points out of this. Well, why did I get 10 points? You're more descriptive with that. I'm getting that name here for Kathy on the chat. Okay.
In a minute.
Okay. We'll come back to that. I'll pull it up in a minute.
Okay.
Now, in terms of from the instructor point, we had our folks downtown kind of chiming in on this. This was a key thing, that there are benefits to you too, right? This isn't only just for the students. I mean, we are here for the students, but making your job a little bit more easy and effective is also beneficial. So once again, this emphasizes learning outcomes for us because we want to make sure that That's what we're focusing on in the classroom. But in terms of the grading, it can actually not only decrease the time you're spending on it, but it can make you more consistent. And I think that's one of the things, particularly when we're grading things that are a little bit more subjective. This is a way for you to find a little bit of consistency across the board. And again, it helps you to clarify what you mean. The other thing that I think is important is this idea of a lens of refinement for your own teaching practice. So as you look at a rubric, you can start to say, you know what, students keep missing this point. So a great example of this is when I created a rubric that we used for the science program assessment. One of my questions, we were looking at scientific content. How well are they learning geology? And so in the rubric, there was one point where it's related to what's called the sinuosity of rivers. So basically how bendy they get. And what are the geologic factors that play into that? Well, they consistently were missing that point. And I was like, why is that? Well, then I went back and looked at the lab, and the lab question is written in a confusing way. So I was like, oh, well, let's fix that. Once we fix that, that point improved on the rubric. So again, it's just that piece of it's a self-check for you and your own practice too.
And I would also say to that point, Karen, I think rubrics should be responsive to the content as well. Right. So I would say, don't get stuck up in the, well, I wrote the rubric that way. So therefore I would like to, Karen gave the example of modifying the assignment to meet the rubric. But I would say you could also say, well, I like what I'm teaching. I feel strong that I'm getting them the right skills. The rubric isn't measuring that. So let's tweak the rubric. That's what we've been really saying to the gen ed folks, that if this critical thinking rubric doesn't exist in anything you're teaching, let's modify the rubric in some ways to fit what you're teaching to make it more useful.
Right. And that's the key thing, is that this can go both ways.
I
Like
think so.
nothing is static
Shouldn't
is
be.
the point.
Shouldn't be.
All right. So if you've not done this, my challenge for you is to try it in just one class with just one assignment. If it goes well, then you can expand. If you're already doing this, then one of the things that I would ask you to think about if you already have rubrics is thinking about that initial design and how do you actually consider it. So before I kind of go through these questions, I'd love to hear from folks in our different spaces here. What are some of the things that you have used to create your rubric? What did you, like when you first put it in Canvas or you first designed it, how did you decide what to put on it? So I saw unmuting downtown. Any comments?
I just want everybody to have an opportunity. The one that I wrote, because there's a specific tool that we use in healthcare called the nursing process. So this happened to be an assignment then that used the nursing process. I broke the nursing process into those pieces that I was looking for. And then also had, this is a writing assignment. So it also had the writing quality piece to it. Anybody else? Florence?
I have, we use two different rubrics, well, actually three. One is for discussion posts. And again, it's based on not only the content, because we have the grading for the initial post, and then the peer responses is another content area. And then the third area is more of the grammar, using a, citing your articles. And then another rubric I have is for a ticket to class on Venn diagrams that they're doing for metabolic disorders. And then a third one that we use, which this one we probably could make better, is our ticket to class, more general ticket to class.
Gotcha.
I'm interested in what we can do to make it better. And again, without the assistance of Pam Pinkleton, I would have never been able to do it. So.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that the rubric is an opportunity for you to emphasize what you value in student work. So it's this opportunity to express not only, again, are you meeting specific learning outcomes, but things like the grammar, right? You know, that's not something that's a learning outcome in my geology class, but I value quality grammar and, you know, just a good written feedback. Or again, this idea of doing research. One of the things that I will do on some of my discussion boards is they have to find a picture to include. And so that idea of having that photo image in there is a requirement. So it's just that idea of what you want to see.
I like to suggest too, a way to double use the rubric ideas. David, you and I were having this conversation to think about the learning outcomes that are connected to the program. So not necessarily, I mean, I promote rubric use for anything and everything. But if you're getting into it anew, it could be an opportunity to say, hey, if our program is really about one of these foundational principles, how are we measuring that? How do we know? And a rubric is a great way to feel confident in that, ideally with an assignment that can be spread across multiple sections of the same course to say, yeah, that knowledge or that skill set is so critical. We teach it here and I want to measure it here. And if it connects conveniently with a Canvas assignment, the watermark tool can help us aggregate and summarize that all. So a faculty member can look at it and say, oh, I'm seeing, or I'm not, the skill set across various sections. So that's another way to sort of scale rubric use to be useful and helpful to faculty, I think.
So if you use a rubric on discussions in Canvas, you have to tell the students where to find it.
Yes.
It's not intuitive.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that.
Interesting. I'll be curious to see.
If I can through my sandbox.
Hmm.
So for those of you who are just starting, one of the things that I would think about is kind of like, where do I start? Pick the assignment that you think might benefit from this the most. If it's one where students maybe have typically needed more clarity on an assignment, I think that's usually a good one to pick. Or you could pick an assignment that is something that you do consistently, like if you have multiple quizzes or multiple discussion boards or multiple examples of that type of thing in your course. Try that, because then you could scale it very quickly, right? Because if you make one, then you can make 4 or 5 as needed. Other things to think about is the detail, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And then this idea of who's doing it. Because one of the things to recognize is that while we are talking about this sort of from the instructor-student perspective, you do have the opportunity to think about how students might use these for themselves or for other students as well. So there was an interesting conversation that happened last semester in our equity reading group that CETL runs. We read the book called Ungrading. And in this book, there were different ways that people were talking about trying to get away from grades in classes. But it was really a broader discussion about how we evaluate students. And there was an interesting sort of comparison of different type of rubrics that can be developed for a course. And so I think it really depends on who you are as a teacher, how you want to grade, what information you want to collect. And so I just wanted to talk about 2 different assignments, but this could be, we could have a whole deeper sort of philosophical pedagogy conversation around this. But the option I'm showing first is what I think most of us think of when we think of a rubric. It's some sort of giant grid system. And so on the grid system, typically you're going to have some sort of criteria, or in this case, they're calling them traits. And then you have levels or categories that are being defined. So the idea is that this is actually coming from a computer programming instructor. And so what they were looking at in terms of what they wanted to assess students on is the specifications of the program that the students wrote, the readability of the program or the coding, and then the reusability. Like, could you actually use this code for other purposes? And so there were then 4 levels of criterion. Now, the thing is, typically then what will happen, and we'll see this in Canvas, you assign point values to these levels, and then those can be easily totaled to get to a final grade for an assignment. So a student might earn, say, a 4 on this, a 3 on this, and a 4 on this. So then they get 13 or 11 out of 12 on that assignment. Again, this is kind of what is beneficial going back to some of the program health perspective, because we can get actual student grades on assignments, and then we can figure out how many students got a grade at a certain level.
I think one of the key aspects for me in rubrics is that because I have very little computer programming experience, I don't necessarily know much about the language, but I should still be able to look at a rubric and make some sense of it. So the thought about using language and description that a non-disciplined person could understand, right? David and I were talking about dental assisting, right? And the specific skills that the students are being taught. I don't know those skills, but I can help David think through a rubric based on his interpretation of what they're doing and then explaining it. And so a rubric should have some language or context in it that others could look at and say, I can basically make sense of that. Now, maybe I'm not in the place to evaluate the student work to know, but looking at the rubric itself, I can say, all right, I can sort of see the difference between unsatisfactory and exceptional. Because again, to me, that's you creating something that's consumable by others.
And so this is an example, like we were saying, that is a very specific type of rubric that is sort of built out and it has a lot of detail associated with it. And I think it really is getting at kind of really trying to categorize or sort of break out degrees of student learning. Now, the author of this article, again, this is from this Riesbeck in the book on grading. He talked about how when you create rubrics like this, there is still this sense of arbitrariness between like, what's the boundary between exceptional, acceptable, acceptable, amateur.
Yeah.
And that's where your professional
Judgment.
knowledge comes in, right? And judgment, yes. And so he's like, that still left me uncomfortable as an instructor because again, students are still going to focus on that. Well, I still got an 11 out of 12 or a 10 out of 12. So what he tended to go to was a much more simple rubric that was really basically just what he calls a single point rubric, where it's basically, did you do it or not? So because in his course, it was really about this idea of building skill sets. And so what he said is that, again, you still have the same criteria that you are assessing by, but basically, does the program work or not? Is the code readable or not? And so then if it is, then you can say, okay, here's evidence of exceeding the standards. If they did an exceptional job, you can kind of write that out and give more feedback there. Or if the students need more work to improve in an area to get to a mastery level, you could do that there.
And I think that's certainly a rubric example that maybe leans a little bit more towards the student benefit side, because I think they're getting very specific feedback there. I think that's more work on the faculty, because now you're not just going through and scoring, but you're actually providing some concrete feedback. Maybe that's helpful. Again, not being a faculty member, maybe the faculty could say, actually, that would be useful to me, but I'm seeing this as a student. I would love to know, well, what should have I done more? Or what did I do well? And a faculty member, a rubric like this requires a little bit more time investment.
Right. And so this is a question that I'd like to pose to the group. Do you feel like there are certain areas where the first example of the full built out grid is more applicable versus times when this sort of smaller yes or no, you sort of meet criteria or not is more effective? Any thoughts on that?
Could you see that being useful, David, to you at all and your dental assisting stuff?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
It is.
Okay.
I think my objective on this is to put the criterion descriptions, and then it has to be numbered 1, 2, 3 or 0. We have NA 0, 1, 2, 3,
Sure.
but we could use like 0, 1, 2, 3, ladder of, the grading system as to the objectives that you are, posting to the side of the of your hard copy. Yeah, because I want to transfer it to what we're doing in Canvas. So
Right.
no, but it's helpful.
Those of you downtown, any thoughts on sort of the big grid versus just a yes or no, you have the skill or not, or you have the competency or not?
Any comments?
I like this little grid. Single point. Yeah. Yeah, I have a presentation coming up that the students, I basically flipped the classroom. And I am in this specifically to look at a rubric for grading that. In the past, it's sort of been a gestalt, you did good, you didn't do good. But I really like this for putting a little more meat into the grading of that for them.
Yeah, I think, especially when you're thinking about a presentation, I mean, I always struggle with my presentation rubrics because I have the sort of meat of the content that they're supposed to be presenting, and then I grade them on the presentation itself. But I always feel a little bit like on the actual oral presentation portion, it feels a little loosey-goosey. And that's where I feel like having this more like yes or no, and then being able to provide them very specific feedback, like you need to, improve your volume, not trail off at the end of your sentences, talk to the room, not the screen, that sort of thing, is where I can provide more feedback.
That's a good point. I didn't think about that. Sometimes rubrics can be really useful ways of getting the concepts in faculty's heads onto something that can be used. So a lot of times you have that sense of judgment or knowledge in your head, like, well, I know what's a this versus a that. And a rubric sometimes I think makes that more explicit, right? So that it can be passed on or shared or debated or discussed.
And that's the sort of thing then that I will talk to students about
Mm,
when we're talking about the assignment. You know, it's like, ooh, I know students typically don't do this little piece.
Mhm.
And so that's a case where I can bring that up. Like talking to the screen is one of my big pet peeves in an oral presentation.
Right, reading
So,
the stuff on the screen.
Well, they can read the screen. Well, but it's just, you know, at least turn to us sometimes, not
Sure.
literally stand with your back to the class. But anyway, I digress. All right. So we're going to jump over to Canvas now because this is not readable really. So I'm going to go through a couple of different discussions. These are all coming from my geology classes. I'm going to show a discussion board or presentation and lab, and I'm going to kind of show how these are created in there too. So give me a second to jump over there. So first, let me come here. So in Canvas, for those of you who are learning rubrics, when you are in a Canvas shell, over here on the left-hand side, you'll find that there is a rubrics tab. And that's typically where I build out all my rubrics and then I can attach them to an assignment. So first, in terms of having the rubrics that I have in here are ones that I actually have built out in my classes, and I can copy them from here into my classes each semester, because this is what I call my sandbox. This is where I just create stuff and then I copy it out to classes. So first, let's take a look at what I call my geology and the news rubric.
Karen, to build it, did you do add rubric on the right?
Yes.
So that's how
Yes.
you initially created these 5
Yes.
sort of templates for
Yes.
you. Okay.
So what I want to do first is show one,
Show
and
one.
then we'll actually build one
Great.
together.
I was just making sure
Yep.
that's how you built them right from that.
Yeah.
screen.
That's, and you can, there's probably like in Canvas, you can get to it like 50 different ways.
All different
But
places.
I feel like this is, if you start in the rubric section, then they're sort of, you know where they are.
Sure, absolutely.
You can find them later.
Yep.
So in a rubric in Canvas, this is what it will look like. I don't know why these lines don't line up.
Yeah,
And the
I've
little,
seen that too. I
yeah.
think the box is the same, right? Table.
The fact that those boxes don't line up, it's pet peeve, but okay. But so basically, once again, you have your title to your rubric, you have your criteria, so what you're essentially grading them on,
Mhm.
the ratings, and then
These
you can
different
assign
points.
these different point values.
Interesting.
And then you can actually label those with a title. So I just use excellent, good, poor, but you could have a sort of, you know, proficient, emerging, whatever you want it to be. And there may be a language that's used in your discipline that is specific to the types of testing that they use, that sort of thing. So ultimately, notice that for some of these, it really is, this is for a discussion board post. So the idea is that they're supposed to go out in the media, find an article that's related to geology in the news in the last year, basically summarize the article for us, and then apply it to some of the concepts that we've talked about in class. So some of this is just the sort of informational, where I want them to have the title and date of the publication. What did they find? A link for a URL, where did they find it? And so like, here's an example of what I've put in as 2 different levels of criteria from what I've seen over the years. Some students will put the link in properly. Some students will put it in, but not actually make it a clickable URL.
Mhm.
And that's what I want to do, because when I'm grading, I want to go back and read
There.
through the articles. And then I have the does not address the prompt as kind of my standard generic end one. And then, so you'll see like there are different point values for different criteria, because I am just trying to get to, in this case, 25 round points.
But were
Because
you also weighting those as being more important?
absolutely, because the idea here is that the summary of the article and why they chose this article
Those
to
matter.
discuss matters more than being able to copy a link.
Yeah,
Right?
good.
So that's why it has this. And then again, I have responses to peers as part of that to go. Now, one of the things that I do have in terms of what makes a good response is that they're directly responding to a classmate. They're citing specific examples of their classmates' post. they might raise a question. It's that whole, you're keeping a conversation going. That's the intent. So, question to those of you in the room, like, does this seem reasonable to the ways that you may have done, grading on a discussion board?
It's pretty much similar for my hard copy.
Yeah,
Is it? Good, good. That's great.
Downtown folks? Any comments? Similar, very different? Okay.
Similar.
Yeah, so this is a typical discussion board type post. Now, I can edit this rubric and I'll show you that in a little bit. Let me show you a couple other types of rubrics in here. So here's my presentation one. And so this is actually nice because I actually open this, and while the student is doing their presentation, I grade them. So then it is just done and done,
Right there, yeah.
right? And again, I used to do this on paper, but now it's all in here.
So while you're listening to them present, you're in there scoring.
Right.
Scoring right away.
Right,
Yeah.
and I'll see if I can, I don't know if I'll be able to look at this, but I'll show you how you can add more information in here. But so here's an example of, again, where there's the content of the presentation itself, but then there's also the sort of presentation aspect. So, you know, the visuals, are they using good images? Are they speaking at appropriate volume? It looks like this one needs to be fixed because these are incorrect. I realize this is an old one.
Images got copied down.
But see, this is how you kind of get started creating one, and you just kind of copy criteria, and then you can adjust it. So see, you'll need to edit
But
this
you've
one.
provided enough in the criteria so that you don't really need a description in the ratings, right? Because
Correct,
you're
correct.
determining, yeah, based on.
Score and then reading title, you don't
Mhm.
have to put the description.
And then the last one I want to show is the one that we use for the geology and science, associative science program assessment. And so this is the one that's a little bit more complicated. It's a 100-point lab that makes it sort of easier to work with. But this is the one, for example, where there's that question about the sinuosity or the bendiness of the rivers. And so this is one where they were consistently missing. So that's where,
But they either get all or none on these.
exactly, because again, it's a short question
Got
that's in there. So there's not enough nuance on some of these. Some of these, like for the graph creation, I could get a little bit more specific in terms of, did they include a title? Did they include axis labels? But in this case, they're literally pulling them off a website, so they're already built.
And did you again change values based on what you wanted them, what was more important to you for them to see? Or to display?
Exactly. So in terms of this one, I really wanted them to practice doing this idea of map creation, going to a website and grabbing data off of the US Geological Survey website in kind of a large external database. So that's why these have high values.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
the one at the top at 21, and so
Yeah.
that must have been important.
Yes, well, that's actually a big table that they fill out,
Wow.
and I think it has 20 slots, and I just gave that one extra point to round it up to 100, that sort of thing.
Sure.
So the idea here, though, is that there's lots of different ways that you can build rubrics, and they're all going to look different depending on the assignments. So let's talk about actually building one, because I know that's why some of you are here. So in this place, underneath, again, the rubrics tab over here on the left, if you go underneath add rubric, this is where you're going to be able to start to build,
Ta-da.
presumably.
There it
It's
is.
down here. So when you start, it's a very simple table. It literally only has one line of the grid on it.
Yeah.
But so this is where you could say sample discussion rubric. So give it a title and then it'll save that way. Then you have your criteria. So your criteria, again, are going to be the different concepts that you want to assess students on. What are the important concepts you want them to learn, your learning objectives, the specific items that you want them to include in the assignment. And so when you do this, let me go back. You click on the little pencil because that's your edit button. And so this is where you would say, for example, for the description, I'm going to say learning outcome number 1. And then here, if you want, you can add a more detailed discussion. So it's as descriptive as you want to get there.
And will that appear in the rubric then? Like we just
Yes.
said, sample text or
So,
something?
yeah. So that if we do that and then hit the update criterion,
Yeah.
you'll see here,
Cool.
then it is listed as learning outcome 1 and then your sample text.
Yep.
You can add another row by hitting criterion. Now, the cool thing is you can duplicate or you can do a new criterion. The duplication is nice if you have lots of things that are the same point values. So like if everything, these 5 things are worth 5 points each for a 25-point assignment, then you can just kind of
It's like
repeat
copy and
that.
paste, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna go ahead and duplicate learning outcome 1, but luckily
So-
it pops up with a new window. So then you can say learning outcome 2.
Oh.
And then this is gonna be sample text with new stuff, right? And so the idea is now we have our 2 lines. So this is how we continue to do that.
Yeah.
Now, the next thing you want to potentially change is your ratings. The default is this 5 points apiece, but you can change that to whatever you want it to be. So for example, if you change these to 3,
Yeah, that's right.
then notice that the total points on it are 6.
So if you have 0, 1, 2, 3, you can just hit the plus, right? The ratings
Plus in the middle.
Yeah.
that-
Yes,
You know,
yes.
and try to
So
do that now.
yeah, so it did that. So let me just
Oh.
accept that. Oh, it needs a title. So put level 2, just for like a mid. And so notice here it says full marks. And so I said level 2 and then no marks, but this is where you can put that, exemplar or exemplary, medium good,
Yeah.
not so good, whatever you want to call it,
In between.
right? Again, whatever makes sense for you. And you can have as many of those as you want, but I think fundamentally less is better for
Right.
you. Because even though there is that question of nuance of how you build out your grid, the bigger it gets, the more confusing it gets in deciding exactly where to mark it.
And it's a fun philosophical debate too, between 2, either they demonstrate it or they don't, or some level of nuance. And we've had this a lot with Gen Ed because we're relying on these rubrics that have 3 criterion. But the faculty who are looking at it are saying, we just assign the point values of 1, 2, 3. And they're saying, we want a 0. We want the ability to say, they're not demonstrating any of these things.
Yeah, it needs to be repeated, so it's 0.
So
I will
having
say that for me, I find having a 0 is always beneficial because they either don't include it, they don't
Missed
show
it.
it, they don't address it, and that's always kind of saves you.
And our philosophical debate on the Gen Ed side is that we're trying to shift out of grade mentality, like that they're not being graded on this, but we're trying to determine some level of development of knowledge or skills. That we are saying they have been taught this, they have been taught it, so it's not brand new, ideally, they have been taught how to write somewhere. And are they demonstrating some level of it versus 0? But it's a fun debate. And we go back and forth, so I enjoy those conversations.
Yeah, so I'm gonna go ahead and put this in here too, just so that we've got it.
But I noticed it didn't automatically update the total.
It
when you
did.
Add that, I still saw it as 3 above.
3 and 3.
Oh, I got it.
So then your
Got it,
total
got
is
it, got it.
6.
Got it.
So, again, it defaults to having, and I believe you have to have at least 2. If you want to get rid of one of these middle ones, you just hit the trash can.
Nice,
And
but it
so
won't
on.
let you delete the ones on the end. Nice.
And so then fundamentally, then when you create your rubric, then you'll see, it'll be listed in there. So notice that for these ones that are created before, you can see how many criterion and how many points are possible. So it allows you to kind of track that as you go.
Nice. And are those 5 different assignments that you have?
Yes,
Karen? And then
yeah.
you will use those
Yeah.
term over term over.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, nice.
And honestly, these are just 5 I pulled into my sandbox. I have a lot more that
Got
I
it.
built out in different places.
Use
Because
different ones.
once you do, reference, you'll go back.
See the benefit of them, right?
Yeah.
Also, Karen, if I can chime in, one thing, questions I get asked a lot for faculty who start bringing the rubrics into Canvas is, like, using the system is great. It's a little clunky, especially for those that have like pretty detailed rubrics, but once you get it in, then it's in and it's there for life. Like you will be, I don't know if you were planning to show that, but you'll be able to find past rubrics, so you don't have to keep creating and recreating the same rubric.
Oh, right
over and
on.
over. The system get it in, a little clunky, but once it's in, then you can just select it and add it to any section.
Right, right. And I forgot if we were gonna talk about that today, the process of bringing them in.
Yeah.
Like bringing in because David and I were talking about that, like if he had it on a Word document somewhere, I don't know if this tool lets you copy, or did you tell me that you can copy
CJ
in?
said that
You have-
you've got to copy and paste or else you have to have a special software.
There's no upload. Word
No
document
uploads,
confirmed.
Yeah.
got it.
How
Yeah.
can we duplicate the second for the criteria, because I made the criterion already. I'd like to duplicate the second description.
So I
Oh,
think,
so there's not one yet. So right now, so there's a difference between, I see.
Yeah.
yeah, so either he's gonna help you or I'll help you.
There it is. That's it. It's
Yeah.
just called place
It's called the
personal.
same thing.
Oh.
And
Yeah,
then when
click
you
on
hit
that
that,
place.
it'll pop up a new window where you can rename it.
Oh,
There it is. Yeah,
Okay.
instead of saying number 2, like.
And then the ratings will be copied, right?
The ratings will be
It
copied.
just goes right under.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's great.
So any comments from downtown?
Lots of comments on me.
Think we're good?
Okay, excellent. Excellent. So let's see if this will allow me. I don't know if it will. Let's see if I do this, because I don't know if the discussions will be in here. I think. I'm trying to see if I can.
Could we
Go
ask
ahead.
a question?
Please.
So one of the questions I had was, I know we set up the rubric there, but sometimes like I have 4 areas where normally if it were a Word document or PDF, we'd have like minimum, words per minute, or, that the articles need to be within the last 5 years, like extra details. And
Yeah.
right now you add it, but it's kind of just at the bottom of the document.
Yeah.
Kind of not at the bottom of the document. So is there a way to make it better or no?
I mean, well, it all goes back to like, if you want to add those points onto the assignment or not. I think that's the fundamental question. So if you want them, like, if they, or are they already built into the assignment?
Okay.
Which, are you already grading on that, or is it just sort of a?
Well, they're, yeah, I mean, it's extra kind of like instructions for them, so to speak. But it's not like it's part of the assignment in terms of your scoring on points with that.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
Right. And that's where, in my opinion, I feel like if I'm gonna get them to do it, I'm gonna throw them a couple points for it. So like, that might be a total of anywhere from like 2 to 5 points to meet those criteria you're talking about.
Okay.
Like, for
So then I can
example.
always the rubric I have and just kind of see where I can add those points in and take away from other areas.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the thing, because like, in my classes, I feel like this very quickly burgeons into this whole discussion of how you philosophically teach your class, how you set up your point evaluation system and all that. But my classes are typically out of like 1,000 points or maybe 1,200, depending on which class it is. And so the idea is that, on these types of assignments, if I'm giving them 1 point out of the 1,000 for the semester to give me a proper URL, okay, that's worth it to me. And it's one of those sort of give me points in a way, but it's also, no, that's part of doing good research, is kind of following up where you got your
You
information.
expect that knowledge
So,
to be demonstrated.
yeah.
Interesting.
So I would just build it into the rubric myself.
And will you hit them multiple times with the same sort of thing? Like, will they, for the URL example, be scored on that multiple times throughout the term? So the total URL may end up being 10 points out of the 1,000 or something.
Right. And fundamentally, that goes back to when we have discussions, one of the things that I really want to emphasize is like, sometimes they actually have to go back to somebody else's article and relate it back to theirs, or it depends on
what you're
information in the assignment.
Interesting.
Do you ever have anybody think, a student, like, no, it's 1 point, I don't care?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Blow it off.
But then it's 1 point and you just click the 0, did not address the prompt, and then off you go, right? So it's one of those pieces where, again, over the span of the semester, I like to have some of those sort of gimme points out there. But then also, the meat of it is really about the summary of the article, why they chose it. And again, notice that, I'm really looking for, again, here, my discussion boards in my class are really getting them to just communicate about science, because we may not have even covered the concepts that they're finding articles about yet, but it's just this idea of like, let's talk about science in general, rather than specific, did they note that they're talking about this specific tectonic plate? You know, that's not the case
Makes
for
sense.
this discussion board.
Right.
Other discussion boards, it is important because we're talking about, well, why did the earthquake happen at that particular location? There, the tectonic plates matter. So it just depends.
Mm.
Other questions?
This making sense?
So I do have some examples of where we could attach the rubric to assignments in Canvas and show you that feedback. But I don't want to put that on the recording because I don't have a way to show that without actually showing some student information. So afterward in the room, we'll discuss. And then again, this is a great opportunity for a one-on-one consult with Cedal, which we'll talk about in a minute. All right, so I'm going to go back to the presentation to wrap up our final slides here. So let's see. I wanted to give Tim an opportunity
Oh, right.
to say a few moments or a few items here.
And we've sort of talked about this a little bit, and the program heads in the room will know, because we've talked about this a little, maybe too much, but this tool that we have with Watermark does allow for aggregation of rubrics within it, so that from a program head level view, right, stepping out of the course, out of the assignment and up. But if the program head is saying, we've got points in our program where we are measuring whether students get these principles, and if we can walk through this Watermark tool together, we can point those out, and then it's just a refresh button and it aggregates the scores and says, overall, your students are either meeting or exceeding or not doing, so that the program head at a glimpse can say, for that particular skill set or that particular bit of knowledge, I'm seeing evidence that my students are getting it, or I'm not, in which case I need to go back and do something about it. Or if they're getting it and they're all getting it, maybe it's too easy of a question or a prompt. But the hope is that we're using the tools that we have to automate scoring so that people aren't, like David was saying, going back and flipping through, wait, where did I score that? And how did I keep that? So my hope is, again, leaning into technology to say, this can do this for us. We don't have to be so tedious with our time. Again, I would rather your time be spent on, well, what does that mean to me? And what does that say to me about my program or about the knowledge that my students, our students are demonstrating or not? And what changes do we think about making to the curriculum because of those results? So I think the tool works well to do that, help us with that.
One other thought from this program perspective, again, with my program head hat on. I think that this is another opportunity for programs who have multiple instructors teaching the same class
Yes,
to
exactly.
use the same assignments
That's right.
that all point back to that program assessment.
That's right.
So the idea is that no matter who's teaching this section of nursing, I don't even know a good nursing number to use, but one that multiple instructors are teaching, the idea is that we can get that information across
sections. Absolutely.
And that gets us a larger data set to show that the majority of our students are learning
That's right.
in their program.
Or we see something that should be addressed and discussed, and we can do that as a way to improve and a way to impact student learning. So I put the little nugget in there about Gen Ed. I've been mentioning that from time to time, but again, stepping outside of the program level, even there, trying to go across disciplines even. We are still, I'm getting more representation from health professions because both Emily Gunn and Gail Melberg are coming to our meetings and offering their suggestions of where students are learning about written communication in nursing classes and where students are practicing critical thinking in health professions classes. So my hope is that we can step away from our over-reliance, I think, on English and math and even, some science-specific biology or chemistry courses to measure these things that really are taught in a lot of our classes. So I'm trying to broaden our range. And again, rubrics can be really helpful with that. So just wanted to make those 2 quick points.
All right. So just to finish up for the day, if you want some assistance thinking through your rubrics in a little bit more detail or just kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of Canvas, again, this is a great opportunity to ask for a one-on-one consult with Cedal. So you just go to Cedal's website and there's a big old button on the page. I'm always happy to chat about rubrics with you. You can email me at my email address. You can do the search through the Canvas help. to get help on building those rubrics. And then also I encourage you to touch base with your program head if possible, because they may be looking to do some of this work as they think about program health. And so if you are just engaging in those conversations early and often, it will be an easier process for all involved.
Good point.
So I'm going to open the floor. Are there any final questions? Thanks for dropping the CETL website in there for us. So a little bit after this session, you will be getting an evaluation form for this session. So please feel free to give us some feedback on that. We appreciate that here at CETL because it helps us, again, build programming that is meeting the needs of our faculty. And so I'll hang out here for a little bit for any questions. But thanks for joining us remotely in all of our different spaces and here in the class.